that I think I learned from, I started working in Africa in 1976 and quit in 2016 pretty much. So I don't know, that's 50 years or something, 40 years. I remember when I first started working there, the educational level of Africans was so low that they really needed long-term expats to help them. And then gradually over time, I did, 2 long-term contracts of 4 years and everything else, and obviously felt indispensable at the time. But then I got into short-term consulting, and more I could see that the educational level of Africans was going up, and they didn't need so much, they needed a lot less the full-time expat help. They needed expertise, they needed management skills, they needed people from the outside to help them go forwards, but it was kind of, the level of the people I was working with was changing. So it was like, it's a significant difference. I think the biggest change in people's mentalities was a cell phone. If only because, I was working in water supply, and to keep water supply working, you need people to pay for the water. But people in rural areas in Africa in general had never paid for services. Water was always for free, because even if the woman had to walk 5 hours, it didn't cost anything. And all of a sudden with the cell phone, people in rural areas started realizing that actually you could pay for services and get those services. So all of a sudden, like, money became a tool, not for emergencies, but actually for day-to-day living, which is also a change in mentality. Because until then, money was, either to try and buy school books or to go to the health center, or, it was for emergencies, for like special occasions. And all of a sudden, they needed regular money to pay for cell phone services. So the challenge on our side was to provide water in sufficient quantity and quality that they would be willing to pay for that service. But that's...
And you had to convince them that germs existed. Is that an accurate memory?
You have to convince Donald Trump that germs exist.
His name is forbidden in our family. No, but I mean, seriously, I remember you saying that, convincing people to do simple hygiene things, relies on our understanding, which is not that old, that germs exist.
Yeah, that's one of the, I remember way back when I was working in Togo, we do participatory health evaluations in the villages and ask them what they thought the major health problems were. And one of the things, diarrhea and other things or what was the causes of the major health problems. And germs were like the 30th on the list, like there was witchcraft, there was the neighbor did it, or, the concept of germs was beyond understanding. On top of which, to deal with hygiene and germs, you need water and soap. 2 things that actually were not that common in villages, and still not so much common, particularly water. Soap, they're getting more soap. But again, all these economies are developing, they're getting a little bit better. But then I was seeing a report on Mozambique, which is closed down because of potential cases. And these village women were going completely bananas because the only money they would get would be selling fruits and vegetables in the nearest town, and they couldn't take it there. So they had no money at all. So they could go hungry, basically.
To the water. So as you know, and you visited us often in Marseille when I was working there, and I learned about the history of the hygienist movement in Western Europe in the 19th century, where obviously Pasteur and a bunch of people discovered that germs and hygiene were important to human health. But obviously the cultural historians also said that this was used as a method of cultural oppression. So the French would come in, oh, this village is dirty, clean it up, throw people out of the houses where there's, oh, you can't use this well, it's dirty. And so it was used as a method of colonial control. Did you ever find yourself in that situation? You worked for the EU. using aid money. You also worked for the EPA for a while in Washington when it was just founded.
I worked for the U.S. government. I worked for the World Bank.
Yeah, so did you feel you were an oppressor, imposing Western values
if you want, I never considered it that way, because actually I've never, relatively rarely deal directly with villagers. I would always deal with my local counterparts. So I would have local counterparts with whom we would discuss the messages and what we wanted to do, the objectives and anything else. And then they would be the ones who actually, with their obviously local language skills and others, would communicate with the communities. The only time I actually felt this a little bit was actually in Togo, because I was in Togo as a water and sanitation project. And we were working with two kinds of civil servants. One was a social affairs civil servant who's, you know, as you could expect, had the best, who wanted to help the communities. And then you had hygiene civil servants who also wanted the best for the villagers, but also had the right to fine villagers who would not
punish them,
hygienic. And we did have this conflict sometimes, because if the two, they would make it a team, the social and hygienic. And so some of the villagers were quite wary of his team because the hygienist could punish them, whilst the social affairs guy couldn't. So they were more open to listening to social affairs. But that was not, again, I never felt, well, and then whenever I worked there, I never felt I was imposing anything. It's one of the things I kind of learned.
Christine, do you want to jump in? You may remember Annick Bureau and I organized a workshop on the power and spirit of water in Marseille. Mm-hmm. And we had artists from Japan, we had someone from UNESCO, and the little memory I remember is the UNESCO man who was African told these wonderful stories about the taste of water and the memory of water. So the women that you talked about going to the village well had such an acute taste of water that they could tell you which well it came from.
I'll tell you even more. I had several experiences where there would be a pond, you know, dirty pond in the village, and we would provide a hand pump in the village not far from the pond with clean water. And what would happen is the women would use the pump water to wash their clothes, but drink the pond water because they were so used to the taste, and the pump water didn't taste of anything.
Yeah, yeah.
So they like the pond water a lot more.
Perrier doesn't come from anywhere in particular. It just has the same taste everywhere. And for people who grew up in a culture where you could recognize the water from each pond and each well and say, oh, it came from there, it was very disorienting and unsettling. And obviously then that feeds into the memory of water, fake science that was hot for a while. And what is it called in France, where you buy bottles of things with minute traces of something. And
homeopathy.
Homeopathy. I mean, obviously, water is fundamental in astrobiology because we're so biased that the only forms of life that can exist in the universe are based on water, when in fact we are probably the exception, not the rule. Anyway, so that, you know, there's a fake scientific quest for life on the moon or Mars. If only we could find water, then there must be life. When it's probable, as you know, the SETI community.
Except there is another reason for finding water, is that you won't have to transport it there.
Well, but I don't. No, let's not get into whether human migration to places with no water is a good idea, like the Sahara Desert. Anyway, there are no wells on the moon, no oases.
We don't, not yet. Anyway, we found some ice down there.
They're all underground. Okay, I have. One last thing of how, and then Christine may have a last thing of how we tie the three of us memories together. I was just in a discussion group yesterday of bioartists, and this idea of redefining hospitality. No, we are hospitable to all kinds of viruses, and we would die without them. we have co-evolved with the microbiome and the ecosystem. And so we are very friendly to viruses, except this one, and we've no idea whether vaccine will work on this one, right? A lot of viruses cannot be controlled through vaccines. They have to be controlled through other means if they're bad for human beings. Anyway, so redefining hospitality of welcoming the enemy. So Christine is twinging because I mentioned this to her. You probably remember you and I had an aunt in England called Annie. She was a judge.
She's a justice. No, she wasn't. She was a justice of the peace.
Justice of the peace.
She's not a judge. It's not quite a judge.
And
justice of the peace will take care of minor problems. Yeah.
But she was an amazingly composed, you know, justice of the peace.
It's someone, one of those people who always knew what was right and wrong. It was kind of interesting.
yeah. She always had a clear idea of right and wrong.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you probably remember the story that I don't know who told it to me, about who she fell in love with.
She fell in love with a German prisoner of war.
At Elslack.
In Skipton, yeah. He was in Skipton and she was in Elslack. And she got sent to the boarding school in Switzerland because of it.
Ironically, Annie was very educated. Obviously, German civilization before the war was the light of the Enlightenment in Europe, right? And so Annie actually spent time in Germany, I think, before the war broke out. No, she must have met the prisoner during the war. So let's forget the details, but she was very hospitable to the enemy. In this case, a German soldier prisoner. It's sort of one of those family secrets that, you know, I'm sure it wasn't Annie who told us that, except she was such a cultivated person, in part because she read so much German literature, and you know, then later fell in love with a German prisoner of war. And so, you know, I don't, yeah, I'm a little bit anguished. You know, she used to come on holiday with us, right, Annie? You remember? I think she came to Senegal with us.
She did?
Didn't she go to Club Med with us?
I'm trying to think.
I'm sure. Because I think Annie and Marjorie taught us how to dance at Club Med. Yorkshire dances.
Well, you know something, I mean, quite frankly, you don't really have a choice about who you fall in love with, right? I mean, you know, life would be a lot simpler if you could just ordain it. So, you know, I don't know who one is to judge anything of that kind.
Anyway, the key idea here was this idea of hospitality, which also goes into hospice care, hospital. Obviously, there's a lot of French intellectuals who've talked about how hospitals have been used as prisons, where governments put people with certain disorders into hospitals.
Mental disorders.
I heard there's water on mountains in the moon that you and I visited.
Water? There's a glacier up there. We went there was a glacier and a lake.
Yeah, on the moon.
On the mountains of the moon in the Rwenzori, yeah.
Yeah, in Central Africa, on the equator, there was a glacier.
Yeah, you remember how cold we were? We were right next to a glacier.
Yeah, and we, you know, we hiked up for 3 days or something. Like good colonialists, we had Sherpas.
We had 8 porters.
8 porters carrying our sleeping bags.
All walking barefoot in the snow.
Yeah, our porters were walking barefoot in the snow. This is, you know, talk about my imperialist past. This is a little bit embarrassing. But the amazing thing there, well, both you and I remember it. Obviously, because of the altitude, we all had altitude hallucinations. And I remember once walking up, one day we were walking up to the glacier, and I looked around and the trees were walking up the mountain with us. You remember that? Because for some reason in that particular forest,
I think you saw Lord of the Rings.
Well, no, but the trees were all pointing uphill. Because the prevailing wind when they were young trees was that way, because it's cold on top of the mountain. And so suddenly I remember these trees walking up the hill with us, up the mountain with us.
Well,
So,
I didn't have that hallucination anyway. That's good.
you ever had any hallucinations?
Not unaided.
Well, you're retired now, so you're allowed to admit hallucinations.
I don't think I've ever had any hallucinations except drug induced.
What was the best drug-induced hallucination you had?
I don't know. I think I always became a little paranoid with those hallucinations because you're definitely losing control.
You're a control freak. Christine, have you had any hallucinations in your life? I've never asked you that question.
Yes.
Okay, so name one.
Well, it was down in the Mexican, between Durango and Zacatecas, and it's the only time I ever took peyote, and I certainly saw Aztecs.
What do you mean, the rocks were walking around dressed as Aztecs?
And the rocks weren't, they were just Aztecs though.
How do you know how did you know they were Aztecs?
Because I was with Indians who were the last remnant of the Indians that escaped Cortez, and they are the Tawapuri Indians.
Okay.
So no, I think, you know, if we were going to have this conversation 5 years from now, it would
At your 75th our 75th and your 73rd birthday party,
we will
Alan.
see how our remembering for the future stands up. So there we go. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.